I am here with Dr. Eric Schwitzgebel, professor of philosophy, University of California, Riverside. Dr. Schwitzgebel, thanks so much for letting me interview you about consciousness. So, the first thing I would like to do is just have you explain to me what we're talking about when asking about consciousness. Because a lot of these other words like awareness or rationality might come up, but how is consciousness its own thing?
Yeah, it's a notoriously difficult word to define. So, but I actually think the concept isn't that hard once you kind of get your head around it. I think it's hard to define because our usual ways of defining concepts don't work. You can't define consciousness, for example, in terms of something else. Like you could define a rectangle, in terms of other concepts, like a plane, four sides, right angles, and then you got the idea of a rectangle from that. But consciousness doesn't lend itself to that kind of analytic definition. In fact, I think the only way to really define it is by pointing to examples. Uh, so that's I think how I like to define it, right? So think about the experience of hearing a tune in your head, an earworm that's lasted for a while, right? That's a kind of experience you have. There's something it's like to have that experience. It's part of, you might say, your stream of consciousness at the moment, right? Or think about the experience of pain when you stub your toe. That's another kind of element of your consciousness. Or think about when your eyes are open and say you're looking at your hand, right? You're having a visual experience of a certain sort. So there's something that tune in your head and the experience of pain and the visual experience all have in common, right? Yeah, your emotional experiences are another example of this, right? If you're feeling angry, it feels like something. If you're having inner speech, right? If you're talking to yourself, right? If you're having visual imagery of, say, what your house looks like from the front, all of these things have something in common. I think they have something pretty obvious in common, right? And that obvious thing they have in common is consciousness, right? They're parts of your conscious experience, your stream of consciousness. So that's what I mean by consciousness, right? And to really help clarify, you can think of some things that are not conscious that are also maybe mental, right? Like the early visual processing in your visual cortex that figures out, like, you know, what's the shape of this thing out there, right? There's all this complex processing that's going on that determines what the shape is of things you're looking at, but you're not conscious of any of that. It's not part of your experience. You have an experience of the shape of the thing, but not of the non-conscious or unconscious processes that deliver that, right? You don't have conscious experience of the release of growth hormones or uh, those sorts of things, right? So consciousness is the thing that all of the examples have in common,
Can
and
you
it's one of the most important things in the world, I think, right? Consciousness in this sense.
you're starting to use these words like non-conscious or unconscious. So can you help me understand how these kinds of mental things differ or what they might have in common other than consciousness or how they're different?
Right. So I saw on that card you had non-conscious and unconscious and subconscious, and all of those I would think of as being kinds of non-consciousness, right? Not being conscious, right? But you have some mental states that might not rise to the level of consciousness. You might think they're subconscious, they're below the level of consciousness. Or you might think of them as unconscious, right? There, you might have a belief, say, some prejudicial belief that you prefer to deny, right? But you might really believe it, maybe, right? That could be an unconscious belief, right? Freud, of course, people might be familiar with him, right? Thinks you have all kinds of unconscious, say, desires to marry your parents or whatever, right? Um, so none of those would belong to consciousness in the sense that I'm defining it. And the sense that I'm using, I think, is a standard sense that most philosophers and consciousness scientists and neuroscientists and psychologists use this term.
So when you're using the word subconscious, unconscious, and non-conscious, you mean the same thing. And it's not what we're going to talk about. We're talking about consciousness
Yes.
itself.
Right.
Okay, excellent.
Yes.
So tell
Right.
me more about consciousness itself.
Yeah. Well, once we once we have our kind of minds around this concept of consciousness, there are lots of interesting questions, like what is going on in my conscious experience at any given moment, right? Some philosophers have thought that the one thing that we know better than anything else in the world is the content of our current stream of conscious experience, right? So Descartes is famous for saying this, right? So Descartes, of course, said, "I think, therefore I am." He also just thought the "think I stand" stands on its own, right? And one of the kinds of things we know for sure, according to Descartes, is that I'm thinking and that I'm having the thoughts that I currently think I'm having, right? So if I think that I'm consciously thinking about a banana, right? Like, could I be wrong about that? Doesn't seem like it, right? Or if I have a sharp feeling of pain in my toe, right? Is that something I could be wrong about? If someone says, "I'm in terrible pain," could someone else say, "No, I'm sorry, you're not. I happen to know you're wrong," right? It almost seems inconceivable that you could be wrong about your consciousness. And so some people like Descartes, thinking through those issues, have thought we have this special privileged knowledge of our own stream of conscious experience that's more secure than any knowledge we could have of the outside world. So that's one big issue about consciousness. Um, we could get into that if you like. Another big issue is what kinds of entities are conscious, right? Are fish conscious? Are bugs? Are robots? Like what kinds of things are conscious? That's another huge set of issues. I'm not sure which. So those are two things we could talk about.
Yeah, let's do both. It sounded like you were about to convince me that I don't actually know what I'm thinking consciously.
Yeah, right. So one of the things I've done in my own work is challenge this Cartesian conception, the conception from Descartes, that we have perfect knowledge of our own stream of conscious experience. I think that the kinds of I gave two examples that are really good for the Cartesian view, but
Bring
I
my
think
toe, for example.
right, it does seem kind of hard to think you could be wrong about that. But there are other experiences that I think it's not so hard to imagine that you're wrong about.
What do you have in mind?
So here's an exercise you can engage in, and the viewers can engage in, right? So close your eyes and visually imagine, if you can, what your house or apartment looks like as viewed from the street, right? So visually imagine that. And now I'm going to ask you some questions about it. How detailed is this image? Is it kind of full of fairly crisp details from the center out to the periphery? Or is it kind of hazy at the periphery? Or is it kind of sketchy altogether? Is it stable? Like if you start to think about like your door, is that suddenly get sharper and maybe the window is now hazy? Or is it all kind of, so is it unstable in that way? Or is it all kind of stable at once? Does it have determinate colors until you think about what colors the various things are? You kind of have to fill in the colors a little bit at a time, or is it all kind of there at once? Is it two-dimensional, like a picture, or is it kind of got a three-dimensional robustness to it? Now, you or your listeners might think, "Oh, yes, no, no, yes, this," and they might have think all these questions are easy, and they got the right answer for all of them. I could ask even more questions, right? But I think most people, when you start thinking about questions like that, they seem not totally easy. And you can imagine how someone could go wrong about them in a way that it's a little harder to imagine someone being wrong about an intense pain in their toe. And then, in fact, if you look at the psychological literature on people's imagery reports, the relationship between what people say about their images, like how detailed and vivid they are, and their performance on the kinds of cognitive tasks that psychologists have often thought involve imagery, right? So the correlation between self-reported imagery and performance on imagery tasks is actually very weak and very inconsistent, and has not been found, in fact, for some of the main tasks that people thought they would find it for. So based on both a kind of like, I think, intuitive sense of your own experience, plus a kind of reading of the literature, that's one kind of experience that it doesn't seem unreasonable to think people might kind of go wrong about. Actually, my favorite example of this, although it's not current conscious experience, but I think it kind of gets at some of the same issues, is the experience of black and white dreaming. So
Tell me more.
when I was growing up in the 70s, a common question was, hey, do you dream in color or black and white? And now nobody asks that. But back then, of course, some television was colored and some television was black and white. Black and white media were much more common in the 1970s. And so when I was first getting interested in the accuracy or inaccuracy of people's reports about conscious experience, one of the first things that I looked at was the history of people reporting whether they dreamed in color or black and white. And what I found was, if you look before the 20th century, there's almost no reports of people dreaming in black and white. Almost everyone just assumes, well, of course, dreams have color in them. And then starting in this 20th century, you start to see more and more people reporting that they dream in black and white. In the 50s, or maybe the late 40s, it peaks. At that time, the common sense opinion in the United States, and most psychologists thought, most dreams most of the time are black and white. Only a minority of people dream in color, and usually it's only a minority of their dreams, right? So your dream might be almost entirely black and white, except you stab someone and suddenly there's red coming out of the wound, right? But other than that, it's all black and white. That would be a pretty typical view of what dreams were like in the 1950s. And then once you start getting the 60s, 70s, 80s, the reports of coloration in dreams go back up. People say they don't dream in black and white anymore. And furthermore, I collaborated with a couple people from China on this. We looked in China, right? So China was technologically behind the United States in terms of the media adoption. And in the year 2000, we looked at reports from Chinese people, right? In the rural countryside, where most people's TV media were black and white. People said they dreamed in black and white. The wealthy urbanites, most of whose media was in color, said they dreamed in color. So there's this nice relationship between people's experiences of their media and what they think their dreams are like. Isn't that weird?
Yes, I see that. So now I feel this pull that you don't actually have an infallible, not able to be wrong grasp of what's going on in your mind.
Right. So you say you dreamed something last night and your dream was like this, right? Most people will say, oh yeah, of course, right? I'll say, I don't know, I mean, you say that, I don't have any reason to particularly doubt it, but I don't think we should take it for granted. And the same thing I think is true when people talk about having visual imagery of a certain sort. They may have some grasp of it, they may not. Let me give you one more example, which I think is really interesting. So this is from work by Russ Hurlburt. He's a psychologist at University of Nevada, Las Vegas. And one of the things he likes to do is he gives people beepers and he sends them out into their kind of ordinary environment. And then the beep goes off at some random interval from about 1 to 60 minutes. When the beep goes off, you've got a specific task. The task is, think about what was the last moment of conscious experience that you had right before the beep. What was in your experience? And then he brings them into his lab and he interviews them about these experiences and tries to get at the truth of what was going on in people's experiences in these randomly sampled moments of experience. The last undisturbed moment before this random beep. And it's a fascinating, in fact, my first book was collaborative with him about this research and how far we should believe people's reports. And, I'm somewhat skeptical about most of these reports, but there's a really fascinating pattern. Lots of people in our culture say, before you sample them, that they have lots of inner speech. They're constantly hearing themselves talking to themselves, or they're hearing some voices in their head. There's this constant stream of words going through their minds. Lots of people say that that's their experience most of the time. You've got this constant stream. And then the funny thing is, when Hurlburt beeps these people, a lot of them don't report inner speech, right? So they're like, they come into the lab, they say, yeah, I've got constant inner speech, that's what we're going to find. And then beep one, and it's like, well, there was no speech. I don't know why, but there was no inner speech in that particular beep. Beep two. Oh, you know what? I was just having an emotional reaction to something, and there was no inner speech there either. Beep three. Oh, I was just kind of looking at something, and I had a kind of thought about it, but there, for whatever reason, it wasn't in words. And people do report inner speech. It's not like it's not reported. But one of the things that I think Hurlburt's works, and then if you ask them afterwards, do you believe your generalization that you came in with before, saying I always have inner speech, or you believe what came out in the sampling process? They always say, no, you know what, my generalization was wrong. The samples, I believe. Now that we've sampled me 20 times, and we found 4 instances of inner speech, I no longer believe I have constant inner speech. Right? So these people, I think, people in general, often have pretty mistaken ideas about what their stream of conscious experience is like. And it doesn't take that much, just like a little sampling with Russ Hurlburt, to radically transform people's ideas about what you'd think, like, what do you know better than like what's going on in your own mind all the time? But 20 samples and you completely changed your idea about what your stream of experience is like. So we've got this kind of feeling of security about what's going on in our own minds that I think we casually get because we're not used to being challenged about it. We're used to, whatever you say, people just say, oh yeah, okay, I take it, right? But as soon as you push on it and really challenge it and really think about it, I think we discover that we have much poorer knowledge of what's going on in our own ordinary stream of experience than we do of what's, ordinary things in the world around us.
You make people less confident in how much they are able to do. So it sounds like we should be less confident about how much we know about what's going on in our own minds.
Yes.
You make people more humble.
Yes.
And then what are the other implications if it turns out you're right and the Descartes version of our theory of consciousness is wrong? How far does this take us? This new idea, your idea, this contemporary idea that the conscious self is much less known than we thought or hoped. Now what?
Yeah. Well, there's one thing that I want to say about that is I want to say 2 things that are almost in conflict with each other about it.
Exciting.
One is that, in fact, it doesn't matter that much because what we really care about isn't that stream of experience. What we really care about, most people care about things happening in the world that they want to happen. They care about their loved ones flourishing. They care about getting the job. They care about their football team winning, right? And they're not like paying much attention to what is their stream of experience while these things are happening, right? That's partly, I think, why we're bad at it. We kind of don't pay much attention to it usually. We don't really care much about it except pain we want to get rid of. But even pleasure, I don't think we care that much about normally. Let me tell you an anecdote from when I was in grad school. So my girlfriend asked me, she said, well, what do you think is the thing that gives you the most pleasure in the world? And I thought for a minute, and I decided it was skiing. Because at the time, well, as a teenager, I was a really expert skier. My mom and I just would go off skiing all over the place and on a shoestring budget. And I loved like standing up at the top of a steep slope and then carving an expert trail down. It was just so wonderful. So that's what I said. And she said, oh, well, that's interesting. When was the last time you went skiing? And I said, well, it's probably been about 3 years. She said, well, maybe if it's been 3 years since you did the thing that brings you the most pleasure in the world, maybe you're not living so wisely. So I said, okay, well, what brings you the most pleasure in the world? And she said, well, probably getting a massage. And at the time, we had a deal, right? If she gave me a back massage one day, then the next day I would return the favor and give her a massage. But we hardly ever did it. So I said, so are you saying that you could get the thing that brings you the most pleasure in the world simply by massaging my back once in a while, and yet you won't do that? So I got her back, as you see.
Okay, so we
Right,
don't
but-
care that much about pleasure.
So yeah, right. So even pleasure, I think, is people say that what they want is pleasure or happiness, but I don't think they're really thinking about it very much. I mean, there are lots of things you can do to increase your pleasure that you don't really do. What you want, usually, most people, is social approval and achievements, and for the people you love to do well, and to get the tasks done that you're supposed to get done, and to not be a dope, right? That's what. So we don't really pay that much attention to our stream of experience. So no wonder we're not very good at reporting on it, and we're not good caretakers of it.
Okay, so if it's true that we don't have great access to our consciousness, your first point is it's really fine. Nobody cares that much.
That's right.
Okay.
That's the first point. And then the second point is basically this kind of the negation of that almost.
Yeah, tell me.
That's why I said it was going to be almost contradictory, right? Because in a way, so in a way I'm pretty sympathetic with that, but another part of me thinks like kind of the thing with the most intrinsic value is consciousness. Like imagine that philosophers call these hypothetical creatures zombies. Imagine that we were like zombies. We had no conscious experience at all. It's like a blank inside, right? Like what kind of life would that be? Right? You'd be walking around, maybe doing some normal things, right? If this is conceivable at all. There are debates about whether this is conceivable at all, right? But it seems like the thing that's kind of most intrinsic value in the world maybe is our own consciousness, right? If you can imagine a world with nothing conscious in it, it seems like a much less rich and good and interesting world than a world in which conscious experiences are present and rich. So we don't know it, but so on the one hand, there's a sense in which we kind of don't care that much as we pretend about it, but there's another sense in which maybe it's a thing we should care about more than anything else.
But I think you lost me probably because
Yeah.
I'm having a hard time understanding the connection between the claim that we don't really have great access to what happens in our consciousness,
Yeah.
and that's what has amazing value. Can't they both be true, that consciousness
Yes.
does give all this value and we don't have great access to it, but it's there?
Yes, those can both be true together.
Okay.
What can't be true together is that we don't really care, and we ought not really care very much about what's going on in our consciousness. And it's a thing of, most amazing value, right? But both of those are compatible with our not knowing it very well.
Okay.
Yeah.
And
so,
okay.
Yeah.
And
so I'm a little bit of two minds about how much we should care about our stream of experience.
When you say our stream of experience, you're talking anthropocentric, about
Yes.
humans and from a human perspective. So could we zoom out a little bit and start wondering, maybe humans don't have great access to their own consciousness, and we don't know what is going on in our minds. And also consciousness is this really valuable thing that gives life meaning. But what about the consciousness of other beings?
Right.
So I had some ideas, and you named some too, like human fetuses, but also insects, snails, fish, animals, plants, like galaxy.
Right.
Like could the planet be? Could there be something it's like to be a planet with water, as opposed to a planet without water? Like I don't know.
Yeah, these are wonderful questions. And they're so hard. Yeah. So um, let me put possible views of this on a really broad spectrum so that the listeners or viewers can kind of understand the range of positions that are open in philosophy. These are positions that are actually occupied by leading contemporary philosophers and psychologists. Right. The most extreme view on one end is panpsychism. Right. So panpsychism literally means everything has a mind. Pan, all, or everything. Psych, mind. Right. So panpsychism, according to panpsychism about consciousness, right, the universe, consciousness is ubiquitous. Everything has universe. A single proton cruising through outer space has consciousness, right? Or participates in maybe some grand consciousness of the universe in which it has a small part, right? So that's one view. You could think consciousness is all pervasive. Everything, even protons, have simple consciousness, right? On the far other end, you could think that the only organisms that legitimately have consciousness or determinately really have consciousness are human beings. So there are philosophers who argue that even dogs and apes don't have conscious experiences. So, uh, or at least that it's dubious whether they do, or that it's kind of a marginal in between case whether they might. So that would be what I call a very sparse view. So the first view is a very abundant view. Consciousness is radically abundant in the universe, right? In the latter view, consciousness is super sparse. It requires a very particular set of conditions that's really only manifested in human beings. And maybe some of our nearest relatives, or maybe even not them. Right? So that's a huge range of views that about how abundant consciousness is in the universe. And I actually think, so, you discover my own tendencies tend to be a little on the skeptical side about all these issues, right? So I tend to think that it's very difficult to know which of these views is where on the spectrum you should be with respect to these views. It's not like you can just build a consciousness meter and hold it up against the side of a planet or an ant or whatever and say, oh, yep, that's conscious or not. I mean, you could try, but any kind of meter that you tried to devise would be based upon already having a theory that other people would deny. So it's a super tricky issue.
Is it hard? Is it hard to know whether some human is conscious or not conscious? And that's the same problem that when we look out in the world, we're wondering if the ant is conscious or the dog is conscious, or is there some kind of like humans over here, other things over here,
Right.
living things over here, like plants?
Right.
Like how difficult is this difficult problem?
Right. So I'm inclined to think when it comes to other humans, there's not really legitimate grounds for doubt about their consciousness, right? So whatever theory of consciousness you have, right, it's other humans have all the stuff that would be plausibly necessary, right? So you might think it depends upon the brain. You might think it depends upon having an immortal soul. You might think it depends upon, having a certain kind of instantiable functional pattern that could be imitated by a computer that's independent of whether you have a brain or not, right? We could get into views like that if you want. But there are various kinds of views you could have of what's necessary for consciousness. But like the thing is, basically, all adult humans who are awake and not radically cognitively impaired have everything that any plausible theory would require, right? So it really is a kind of skepticism gone too far. Right? Like I have skeptical inclinations, but I'm not a radical skeptic in that I just doubt every single thing, right? So I don't think there's any good grounds for doubt about other humans. And I actually am inclined to think when we get to, apes and, other mammals like dogs, right? They've got pretty much everything. They're lacking a little bit of something, right? In terms of they don't have quite the level of higher order self-reflective consciousness that adults humans have. But it's only a small minority of views that would think that you really have to have that in order to have consciousness. So they've probably got enough. I'm not, although there's some theorists who doubt that, I'm not really among those theorists myself. But once you get a little farther, once you start talking about lizards and frogs and snails, then it's like, it depends a lot on your theory. Some theories think consciousness is pretty special, requires a lot of stuff going on, requires a pretty sophisticated mechanism that, highly sophisticated social animals like dogs and apes and humans will have, but, the lizards and snails, maybe they don't have that. On the other hand, there are other views that are like, lizards and snails, they perceive their environment, they take care of their bodies, they do multimodal integration and navigate around the world. What more do you want? I mean, it seems like they're aware, conscious, or whatever of stuff, right? So on other theories, they should be clear cases of having consciousness. So once you start to get into that middle territory, that's where I think it really depends what theory is right. But the problem is there's just a huge range of theories about consciousness, and we're nowhere near legitimate scientific consensus about what the right theory is. And then this gets worse, I think, when you start thinking about hypothetical cases or future cases like robots. Like, what would it take to put consciousness in a robot? Well, it depends a lot on your theory. And we don't have the right theory.
Right. Okay. So let's return to human beings, because you're making me wonder. So I just want to ask now: is the difficulty of knowing what one is thinking? Is it the tool that we use to figure out what we're thinking, or is it the thing we're trying to learn, which is what we are thinking? What about this process of us thinking about, like, okay, what was the last conscious thought I had? Why is that so difficult? What's the
Right.
thing that's making it so elusive? Do you have a theory about that?
Yeah, I do. I think it's multiple factors,
Okay.
right? So one factor is, as I was saying before, people don't really attend much to their conscious experience. They attend much more to the outside world. Our tools and categories and concepts are all designed for the outside world. So in fact, when we try to describe our conscious experiences, we normally just import words that we use for the outside world, right? So you have, say, the experience of seeing a round thing. You say, oh, well, I got an experience of kind of a visual experience of seeing something round, right? Well, that's just taking, like, roundness, that's a property of outside things, and now you're kind of adopting it to talk about your experience. So if you say something tastes salty, what you're doing, you're talking about salt is a thing in the world, right? You're saying, well, it's got the kind of experience that's kind of like, so we don't even have like a good vocabulary for talking about it, because we don't really pay that much attention to it normally, right? So that's number one. We don't have the practice, we don't have the tools, we don't have the categories. And then number two is conscious experience is much less stable than our experience of the world, right? So if I hold up my hand and look at it, right, the hand itself, the five fingers are always there, it's in a constant stable position, right? The hand itself is unchanging pretty much, right? But as my eyes are flicking around it, my visual experience is now on my thumb, and now it's on my palm, and now it's here, and now I've been distracted by this thought that I'm talking about. My eyes wandered over here, right? And now I'm not really paying attention, and then I am paying attention, right? So the visual experience of the hand is this constant flux, right? So we've got bad tools to get at this thing that's like, a tornado through a magnet factory, right? And then on top of that, the third problem is that as soon as you start thinking about your experience, that changes the experience.
Oh, yeah.
Right? So the thinking about what my visual experience is now kind of turns that visual experience into kind of like a theatrical version of itself. And now you're not really having the same experience, because now half of your mind is on the thinking about the fact that you're having that experience, and that changes the experience more. So you got these three factors together. It's not like one thing that makes it impossible. It's that there are three things that make it very difficult. And each of those make it quite difficult, and you multiply three difficult things together, and you got something even more difficult.
Amazing. Yes, I understand. I would agree. That sounds challenging. Okay, so my last question would be open-ended. If someone was curious about consciousness, is there anything that you haven't covered so far that you think you need to say before we end?
Let me give you one more puzzle about your own conscious experience that I think is kind of interesting, because it's related to the sparseness abundance thing we were talking about with animals, and robots and galaxies and protons and all that. But it's within yourself. I find that people have very different intuitions about how sparse or abundant their own experience is. So a sparse view of human experience is that you really only have experience of one thing or two things or three things that you're attending to at a time. And maybe there are periods during which you have no experiences at all, right? So one example of this is absent-minded driving, right? You're driving along, right? And then you kind of, oh, I'm at my parking lot, right? You've taken this route 1,000 times, right? And then you think, wow, it seems like I maybe didn't have any visual experiences of the road as I was driving. I just was driving in zombie mode, right? And maybe you were having some thoughts that you consciously experienced, or maybe not even that, right? So some people find that intuitively plausible. Other people think, what? That doesn't make any sense.
I've done
right?
it.
And then, so that's one view, the pretty sparse view, right? Another view thinks that our own stream of experiences is quite rich and abundant with experiences in many different modalities at once, right? So at any one moment, you are simultaneously experiencing your feet in your shoes, experiencing the hum of the fan in the background, having visual experience of the whole visual field all the way out to the periphery, having a little bit of an emotional experience, having a little bit of hunger, having a little bit of leftover taste of coffee in your mouth, maybe having, another, right? So at every moment of your existence, you've got this huge wealth of experiences, right? So this is the sparse, abundant dimension within your own experience. And kind of like I was saying with the inner speech stuff, most people feel, if you ask them, like they know what the answer is to that question. Oh, my experience is like this. The thing is, people give different answers, but they behave the same on the outside, which already makes me wonder, like if some people really have almost no experience and other people have a wealth of experience, don't you think they'd act differently? But they don't seem to. And then when you give them beepers, they don't always report. Like the people with a wealth of experience, sometimes they'll say, you know what? And I've done this, right? So this is some of my own research, right? Some of those same people will say, you know what? At that moment, I think I had not like a single bit of experience at all. I know that doesn't make any sense, right? But that's what it seemed like, right? And other people who say, oh, I hardly have any experiences. If you ask them like, okay, I'm going to give you a beeper and your only job is tell me whether you're having tactile experience of your left foot. Right? So they say, like, I almost never have experience of my left foot. They're on the sparse side of this issue, right? They almost never have experience of my left foot, right? Give them the beeper half the time. They'll report having experiences in their left foot, some of them, right? So like, well, I guess experience is more abundant than I thought. So, and I'm not sure whether I believe even those reports, right, one way or the other. I'm not sure. I think there are all kinds of methodological difficulties with this. But I want to invite your viewers to just think about the possibility that the stream of experiences may be rather sparse or maybe rather abundant, and it's very difficult to know which it is. Let me tell you one last thing about people who think that it's abundant. The people who are sparse, who defend sparse views, think there's a certain kind of illusion that gives you the idea that your experience is abundant. And this is sometimes called the refrigerator light illusion. Right? So imagine a 4-year-old who opens the refrigerator and sees the lights on and then closes it and says, I wonder if that light's still on. And then opens it up and the lights are on, right? And then closes it, right? And then says, checks again, and then concludes, the light must always be on because it's always on whenever they check it, right? So friends of the sparse view will say, look, you might think you have constant tactile experience of your feet in your shoes, but that's the refrigerator light error. It's just that when you think about, oh, I'm having experience, that act itself creates the experience. You weren't really having it all along. But then friends of abundance can say, oh, you think you weren't having any experience of that road when you were driving. It's just because you forgot. You forget huge amounts of things. You forget things after just a few tens of milliseconds. So maybe you're having lots of experience and you just forget it. So if you find one view or the other like seems to you kind of obvious, one thing that I think can help is to realize that they're actually the refrigerator light error and the problem of forgetting are kind of pretty substantial methodological problems that whichever side you're on, the other side can kind of appeal to as a way of trying to cast some doubt on whatever side you're confident of.
That's complicated.
Yeah, I know. Maybe it was a little too complicated.
No, that's okay. I mean, you're just showing how whatever side you're on, there's also a reasonable support for you and for your opponent.
Exactly.
And whatever defense you want to use against the other side, there is an opponent that's going to push away your defense. It's just like a matrix of complicated pieces there.
That's right. That's right. That's why that's part of what I find fascinating. I think it's such a complicated challenge to figure out this thing that seems like, right, according to Descartes, it's like the most obvious thing in the world is your stream of experience. And I think once you start thinking about it, it is the most strange and difficult and mysterious thing in the world.